Okay, good evening. So welcome. Thank you very much for that introduction. So for the halacha shir tonight, I, as ever, try and choose a topic which A, relates to the parasha if possible, and B, something which I find of interest, and I hope you will find of interest. And this particular topic, younger siblings getting married before older siblings, I think is fascinating. And we've got three in the series. So next week, it's separate seating at weddings, and then please God, the following week is prison from a Torah perspective, all related to the parsha. Some very interesting topics. So tonight, younger siblings getting married before older siblings. First of all, I give credit to Rabbi Daniel Rosler. He's got a fabulous new website, and he's a friend of mine, and he's a tremendous Talmud Chacham, and he's got a wealth of experience and knowledge. And he's got a share on this topic, and I've taken a lot of the Makoros from him, so he can get all the credit and I can take the mistakes. Of course, it's related to this week's parsha, because Parshas Vayetze is the famous incident where Yaakov Avinu is looking to get married to Rachel, and his father-in-law Lavan switches Leah and Rachel, and his justification for it is that that the younger one shouldn't get married before the older one. Let's take a look at the first box. If you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com. I'll send you the handout. Vayhi, says the pasuk. This is in Perek Chavtes, pasuk Chafhei. Vayhi ba'boker v'hinei Leah. And it was the day after the wedding, and he suddenly discovers that it's Leah. Vayomer Lavan mazos osisoli. And Lavan, can you picture the scene? Yaakov says to Lavan, you tricked me. He tried everything. Rachel bit kaktana. He tried to do everything he could to make sure it was the right one, and yet it didn't work. Why did you cheat me? So what is Lavan going to say to that? What's his response? This is not the way we do things here. To give the younger one before the older one. Now, the question is this. How do we reckon with this? Is this binding in halacha? What does it mean? And I think the difficulty is that if it is sort of reckoned in halacha, this is the question. Why are we taking on board what Lavan says, i.e. this is not, we don't do this around here, we don't get the younger one marry the older one before the older one gets married. Why do we give more credibility to that than to Yaakov Avinu? Because clearly he wasn't troubled by it. He was willing to marry Rachel first, or he was willing to marry Rachel even though she had an older sister Leah. So why are we taking on board Lavan's sort of response and not Yaakov Avinu's initial hope? So that's one question. And furthermore, just to add to that question, it's interesting, we do take on board other things that Lavan does. So for example, please God, you go to any chastan at the bedeking, you say a very beautiful pasuk. The pasuk says, we based it on the pasuk that Lavan gave to Rivka. The pasuk says, "Vayvoches Rivka vayomer la." This is in last week's parsha, Parshas Chayesara. Achiseinu at hayila alfei revava. It's a beautiful pasuk that you are our sister and you should be the mother, the matriarch of myriads, of tens of thousands, and that's the bracha we wish every color. Just after bedeking, that's the minhag in Klal Yisrael. Who said that? Well, it was Vayvorcha, it was it was the family. But at that point, Rashi tells us Basul had just died. So Lavan was the mainstay of the family then. So it was a bracha that Lavan gave to Rivka. So we do sort of take on board sometimes what Lavan says. So why here do we take on this concept of Lo Yasen Kein B'Mkomeinu Loses Hatzir Lifnei HaBechira? Now this question I saw asked in a sefer called the Tcheles Mordechai. The Tcheles Mordechai is someone known as the Marsham. His name is Reb Sholem Mordechai HaKohen Shvadron, and it's probably well known by Reb Sholem Shvadron. We're familiar with him being the Maggid, all the Maggid's books. Pesach Koren, I think the initial Maggid books were based on stories of the famous Maggid of Yerushalayim, Reb Sholem Shvadron. Now he is named for his grandfather, the Marsham, Reb Sholem Mordechai Shvadron, who was a Rav, and he's got Shaidas and Shuvas. And he's also got a Pirush on Chumash. He called it the Tcheles Mordechai. And in this Pirush, he asked the question, Yesh Lahavin, I'm in the second box, Yesh Lahavin, to B'Tosis V'Kiddushin V'Shach, and I'm going to get to these sources soon, Paskinan Kain. We paskin this concept of Loses Hatzir Lifnei HaBechira, to give the younger child shouldn't get married before the older child. But it didn't bother Yaakov. He was willing and wanting to marry Rachel before Leah, or before even Leah came onto the picture. So he wanted to marry a younger sister. But it was just Lavan who said this. That's his question. Now, we're going to explore this in halacha. But before we do that, I want to share with you the answer that the Tcheles Mordechai gives. It's a very creative answer. You may like it, you may not like it, but it's a very creative answer, and I just want to share it with you. In Rashi, in yesterday's parsha, in Parshas Toldos, the pasuk says, "Va'achri chen," when Yaakov and Esav are both born, the pasuk says, "Va'achri chen yotza achiv v'yodei chezes ba'kev Esav," that both children are born, but Yaakov is holding on to the heel of Esav, Vayikra Shema Yaakov, and therefore they called his name Yaakov, alluding to the fact that he was holding on to the heel of Esav. Now, Rashi says the famous tube mashal. What does that mean? Says Rashi, quoting the Medrash, Shamaiti Medrash Agoda, Hadorsha lefi pshutai, Bedin haya oiches by la'akvai. Really, Yaakov Avinu was trying to prevent Esau from sort of coming out of his mother's womb first, because Yaakov noitza mitipa rishona, because they were twins. But Yaakov was conceived from the first drop, the Esau min hashniya, and Esau was actually younger in terms of conception. Tzeu lemad, I'll prove it to you. This is quoting the Medrash. Mishfoiferes shapir katzar. Imagine you've got a thin tube. Ten lo shtei avonim, and you put in it 2 stones, 2 pebbles in this tube. Zu tachastu, one after the other. Hanichneses rishayna teitze achrona. The one that goes in first will actually come out last. V'hanichneses achrona, that which goes in second, teitze rishayna, will come out first. And therefore, nimtza Esav hanoitza ba'achrona, Esav, who was conceived second, yotza rishon, he would actually be the first to emerge. V'Yaakov shenoitza rishayna Yotzachar, and therefore Yaakov, who was conceived first, would actually be the second to emerge. The Yaakov Bala Akvei, and Yaakov was trying to prevent him, was trying to stop him, Shei Rishon Leda, Karishon Liyatzira. Just like he was the Rishon Liyatzira, he should also be the Rishon Leleda as well. For Yifta es Rachman, he should break his mother's womb. For Yitel es Bechera min Adin, and therefore take the Bechera sort of legally, as it were. That's the Rashi, the famous Rashi that he quotes the Medrash. Okay, now, says the Tcheles Mordechai based on this Rashi. Venira, next box. Venira lefi mashakosov hachida benachal kidumin. The Chida, Reb Chaim Yosef David Azulai, the famous Sephardi Rav, writes in Nachal Kidumim, Parsha Zu, b'shem Rabbeinu Ephraim, the Rachel v'Leah hayu tu'umos. He said that Rachel and Leah were actually twins. It's just that Rachel may have been conceived earlier, but Leah was the older of the twins. V'hinei. But Rashi, Parshas told us Kosov, Rashi, i.e. the above Rashi which we just read, the one who is born first is actually conceived second, and the one who is conceived first is actually the latter to come out. Moshel Feferes Ayin Shom, and that's the Moshel of the Shferes which I just read. Yaakov choshev es atzmai lebechar neged Esav. And Yaakov felt that he had the din of a Bechar relative to Esav, because he was the Bechar in Yetzirah, i.e. he was conceived first. And using the same logic, Rachel, therefore, who was the youngest, she was the second to emerge, she must have been the first to be conceived, based on this tube pebble analogy. And therefore, he was the Bechar, Yaakov felt, and therefore Rachel was also the Bechar. But Lavan felt that Leah was actually the Bechara because she emerged first, and therefore he said to Yaakov, we don't do this. Imkain, so therefore it comes out, Yaakov Hiskim, Yaakov actually agreed, amazing. It turns out that Yaakov and Lavan were not disagreeing. They both agreed to the principle of lo yasavim kameinu lo sesatzir lefnei bechira. It's just they were only arguing who is the bechar. Yaakov felt that just like he is the Bechor Yitzira, well, so too Rachel is the Bechor Yitzira. And therefore, I want to marry Rachel because, after all, we have a principle of not giving the Tzira Lifnei HaBechira. But Lavan was of the opinion, no, that actually Leah is the Bechira because she was the first to actually emerge from the mother. Okay, but that's the very creative way in which the Tcheles Mordechai answers the question. But either way, that explains why Yaakov, we don't follow Lavan, and how can we follow Lavan and not follow Yaakov? The answer is that Yaakov was agreeing to Lavan in principle about this concept. Yeah.
But then that raises a halachic question. What's the bechor?
Correct. Correct. So you're right. This is not a psak in halacha, and it's a very creative drush to explain why this particular question. But you're right. There's sort of, if you like, there's a bechor in theory and in practice. And Yaakov felt he was the bechor in theory, and therefore Rachel was also the bechor in theory. But just like Rashi says that he wanted to be the bechor in both. He was. Where's Rashi? He wanted to be the V'yizles HaBechor Min Adin because he wanted to be the Bechor in both, in theory and in practice. Okay, fine. Now, yeah, please.
Just a question on the Rashi. I don't understand how practically whatever goes in first.
It's a tube with a. Imagine a tube with a no. It's not hollow at both ends. Okay. In other words, it's a tube which has got a bottom on it. And therefore you put something in, so therefore the only way out is the one top one at the end, the other end. So you put two pebbles in. Yeah. Imagine a test tube, right? So you've got a test tube, so you put in the first pebble, the second pebble. Yeah. Do you have the same question?
Not a different question.
Yeah.
If we're using Lavan as a source here, does it not make a difference the fact it was acting in bad faith?
And therefore it should be a bad precedent. But true, we're not disputing that his motives were lowly, nefarious, and not to be, not to aspire to. But at the end of the day, as we'll see soon, he seems to say this concept of lo yasakim kamen lo hasir lifnei bechira, and that seems to suggest that there is this principle. And as we'll see, and according to Tcheles Mordechai, Yaakov actually agreed with the principle, and we'll see soon that it features in halacha and it's recognized in halacha. So you're right, the intentions of Lavan were not very noble. But still, it does feature in halacha. And what we're going to see tonight is, after we've explored where it features in halacha, what do we do in practice? Is it an absolute halacha? Is it just sort of a nice idea? Is it an established custom? How do we deal with it in today, 21st century?
So Lavan isn't the definitive source?
Well, he is the source. In other words, the words lo yasev kain bimkamein lo sesatzil lifnei bechira come out of the mouth of Lavan. So he is the source. But the fact that the Torah puts it in the Torah gives it credibility. It doesn't give a hechsher stempel for Lavan as a person per se. The fact that the Torah, puts it in his vocabulary gives it credibility. Okay, let's take a look. There's a Rashbam. The first place, it features in a few places in Halacha. The first source we've got is a Rashbam. Now, this is the bottom of the box. This is a Rashbam in Bab Basra Daf Kuf Chof Amud Aleph. So the Rashbam says, Keshenisu b'noi Slofchod. When the daughters of Slofchod got married, Monon hakos of derech kuduloson. This is all quoting the Rashbam. And we know that the b'noi Slofchod appear twice in Chumash, but both times the listings are slightly different. The order is different. Here, he says when they get married, the pasuk which deals with their marriage, it lists them in chronological order, in age order. Tichsiv v'tiena mochlo tirtza chogla milka v'noya b'noi Slofchod livnei doidehen lenoshim. So the context of that pasuk is talking about marriage. Or mistaber, and it makes sense that in this context they're listed in age order to kach noldu, because that's when they were born. And therefore, presumably, they would get married in age order because of the principle. So you see the Rashbam takes it on as axiomatic that this principle is applied in the case of marriage. Second source is a Taisus. Taisus in Kiddushin Nun Beis. Very interesting Taisus. Says Taisus there in the next box, Ma'aseh bo lifnei Rabbeinu Tam, b'bnei shel harav Rabbi Oshia Halevi. The case came in front of the great Rabbeinu Tam. The Rabbeinu Tam was one of the great Bali Taisus, and concerning the son of Rabbi Oshia. What was the case? Shekidesh bas Oshia. This young man married the daughter of a very wealthy man. V'omar bitcha mekudeshes li stoma. And when he proposed to her, when he was married her, he was talking to the father, and he said, bitcha mekudeshes li, that your daughter is mekudeshes li. And that is a common expression in the Gemara and Kiddushin of how you can affect a marriage. V'lo pirish pleinis bitcha, and he didn't say which daughter. So there's confusion. Which one is he referring to? V'omer Rabbeinu Tam, to mekudeshes, that she's going to be married to this daughter. Yesh lanu loima de kiddush hagadola, that it's going to be the older daughter. That's of course who he meant. Mishum de lo yaseh kein b'mkamein lo seis hatzilif me'abachira. So Rabbeinu Tam recognized that principle of that we don't marry the younger one before the older one. But in practice, Rabbeinu Tam didn't actually paskin that, but he certainly recognized the concept of. Third place where it features is Shach. The Shach in Yeredein, Reish Mem Daled, quotes the Bach. The Bach, and these are giants of halacha. Kosovo Bach, Hochi Perushay. If brothers or sisters get married, imagine you've got two sisters, and one may be older than the other one. And one of them is God mechaver b'chochma, and one of them is younger, but is smarter, is greater in chochma. Lo yakdimu lasos nisuim lekoton b'shonim. Don't let the younger one who don't let her get married first because she is wiser. Rather, you should actually let the older one, age one, get married first. And that's the Shach quoting the Bach. So you see that if you've got two sisters, one of them may be, I know she's younger, but she's more intelligent or whatever it is, that's not a good enough reason to let her sort of jump the queue and go ahead of her sister. So you see that it is recognized in halacha. It's brought Tosfos, the Rashbam, the Shach quotes the Bach. These are very established sources. However, there is a difference between established sources and established minhag and binding halacha. And that's what the point that Tzitz Eliezer makes. The Tzitz Eliezer was one of the great poskim of recent times, died in Waldenberg, passed away not that many years ago, and he was the Rav in Yerushalayim, and he was the posik in Shari Tzedek. So there are many of his tshuvas medically related, but he's a very well-known posik. In the Shaylas and Tshuvas Tzitz Eliezer, this is in Chelik Chof Beis Simon the Beis Ois Dalet. This is the next book, paragraph 4. This is what he says. Very interesting. That which Lavan says to Yaakov, Lo Yasa Kein Kamin Lo Ses Tatzilif Nabachira. Hine Halacha Mufureshes Lemotzinu Bezeh B'Rambam B'Shulchan Aruch. We don't find anywhere in the Rambam or in the Shulchan Aruch that this statement is actually brought lahalacha. Avul kviyas minhag al kach. There is an established custom that the older child gets married before the next child. And we find that we find it sort of recognized. It's given credibility in the poskim, but it's not binding halacha. And that which I said that is sort of an established custom, but not binding halacha. Kach mefarish gam ha'archaim hakodesh b'pashas vayetze. The Archaim takes the same view, that it's an established custom, but it's not binding halacha. And he explains the mishum kach lechosh Yaakov mikaydim letanazu. And therefore the Archaim says that's why Yaakov Avinu wasn't really troubled by it, because it's not a binding halacha. She'ein derech lo satzir, etc. Because if anything, this is a Lavan's, the onus is on him to tell him about it. And it's not binding that if he wants to choose to give the younger one over in marriage, he's entitled to do that. And then he quotes the Marsham that we mentioned earlier. And he sort of puts a lot of efforts and creativity into figure out why this is why we follow Lavan and not Yaakov Avinu. Etc. Why Yaakov Avinu wasn't troubled by that, and we explained what the Marsham's very creative answer is. The suggestion seems to be, given that the Marsham is sort of trying very hard to figure out why is it that we're following Lavan and not Yaakov, This seems to imply that this is taken as halacha. That's why he wants to figure out, why are we following Lavan? But that's not true, says the Tzitz Eliezer. I'll prove it to you. Because the same Marsham in his Truvas, he himself writes not like that. And he gives you the Marimokim to bin Denenu Nishal Kagoin Zed, Allah and then just skipping a line. It's just manners and derech eretz to do it. It's not a clear absolute halacha. And then he finishes off. And then he adds a few other interesting rules. So what emerges from the Tzitz Eliezer is that it's an established custom. It finds certainly sources in halacha, but it's not a binding halacha. And then he throws in a few other very interesting rules. So here we go, and we'll see this plus the Rabbi Weiss also puts a few conditions on it. So if I'm at the penultimate paragraph in paragraph 4. It's only talking about two daughters. Now that's an interesting one. So far we've been talking about two daughters, an older one and a younger one, and we've determined that it's an established custom that the older one should try and get married first, but it's not a binding halach, and if the younger one wants to, she can. What about a brother and a sister? Let's say you've got an older sister and a younger brother. Says the Tzitz Eliezer that it doesn't apply. What's the svara that it shouldn't apply? So he gives a great svara. Because there's a difference between the boy and the girl. And it's, again, we're looking at it from halachic lenses and not sort of, social niceties and things like that. What are we looking at? Well, what's the halachic difference? The difference is that the boy is mitzuvah on pruruvu as opposed to the sister. Women, remarkably, are not mitzuvah on pruruvu. They're not commanded to have children. Why? Okay, that's another topic. But they're not mitzuvah. Therefore, the younger brother shall ben mitzuvah pruruvu v'lo yabas. And therefore, if the younger brother, there's more impetus halachically for him to get married because he's got to be mekayim the mitzvah of pruruvu. Masha'inken, it's not a driving obligation on the older sister. And then if you look at the next paragraph, and when this sort of case comes in front of me, and I was asked in practice, what's the story? The parents, it wasn't the parents who came to me, it was a younger sister who came to me, says Dayan Baldenberg, that she had the opportunity to get engaged ahead of her older sister. And the older sister wasn't the Bechera Mamish in the case that came to me, he said. In other words, to come a Mevugaris Yosef Mimena Kvai Schatnu, that there were older siblings who were already married. And the Mevugaris, the older sister, says, I'm actually not in a hurry to get married. So she was okay with it. And therefore I said, okay, no problem. So therefore the younger sister wants to get engaged, and the older sister was okay about it, so then there's nothing to discuss, and therefore she was matarit. So the Tzitz Eliezer, just to summarize what he said, he has concluded that it's not a binding halacha, that it's an established custom. He cites several sources, which we've seen inside, the Rashbam, Tosfos, the Bach, and the Shach we've seen. It applies to brothers as well, but not in the case of a younger brother and an older sister, because there, for sure, the younger brother, if the opportunity arises, should go first. Now let me just finish with Rabbi Weiss, and then just a few sort of final words about this topic. Rabbi Weiss also allows it. He says that it's not a binding halacha at all, and if a younger sister wants to get married before an older sister, then she is entitled to do so. And he puts on a few more conditions which make it, if you like, less the concept of losei satzir lifnei bechira much sort of less relevant. How so? Because it only applies, he said, when both daughters are already engaged and the parents have two weddings to make. And if that's the situation, then, and only then in that situation, they should arrange the wedding of the older one first. But not, when one is wanting to get engaged or something like that, then we don't apply this rule. So that's a major caveat. And then the second point is also a very interesting one. He says that the obligation, one of the mitzvahs that parents have is to marry off their children. And the obligation, he says, that the Gemara in the Mishnah in Kiddushin, and the obligation is on the father, that if, for example, his son, let's call him Reuven, wants to marry Rachel, then that's, if that's fine. But in other words, the obligation on the father. But if Reuven himself wants to date Rachel and get married to her, then it's fine for him to do so because it's his mitzvah. And indeed, that was why Yaakov Avinu was entitled to do what he did, because he wanted to marry Rachel. So that changes things quite a lot, the way Rabbi Weiss understands this. So I think what's emerged is quite clear that it does appear in this coming week's parasha, and indeed Lovan does say that, but it's not a binding halacha, and it's just an established minhag with various caveats given by the Tzitz Eliezer and Rabbi Weiss, which do change it quite a lot. But I should add an important postscript. Clearly, it's a very sensitive topic, and a lot depends on the dynamics at home and the family, and really the shalom should be primary. And sometimes you need to ask Das Torah and to ask Shilas if that's needed. And I'll finish with one interesting anecdote. One time a family came to Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and it was a father. The father had several children, and it got to the point where the youngest child, suggestions of shidduchim were coming to this youngest child, and there were many older siblings who were not married. And the father didn't know what to do. And it wasn't a question of one or two children. There were many children who were older than the youngest child, and now suggestions were coming up for this young girl. And so he asked Rosh Shlomo Zalman, what should he do? So Rosh Shlomo Zalman told him the following, he said, let me tell you a story. He said, imagine you come home on a Friday night, and you're locked out of your house. You forgot to bring the keys, the Shabbos belt, whatever, and you can't get into your house. So, you're standing outside the front door. Inside looks temptingly warm and cozy, and you're standing outside. How are you going to get in? You spot there's one window on the second floor which is open. Who are you going to send up to get through the window? The youngest, the most nimble. They can climb up. You help them up. They climb through the window, and they'll open the door. They'll come around and open the door. He said sometimes that's how it operates. Sometimes you've got to let the youngest one in, and they'll open the door for the others. Now, I don't know what happened in that story. Hopefully there was a very happy ending. But what seems to be that whilst it's an established custom, there's no hard and fast binding rules. And one has to deal with it very sensitively. It's clearly a very sensitive topic. And hopefully, shalom will reign, and also shidduchim and chasnas will also reign.